Hey people, my name's Krishang. I do all things smart contracts at Third Web. Pretty excited to be giving a talk for Web3 Con, and I have a talk coming up on a pretty grand subject, subject being a developer's path to bringing Web3 to the billions. I have a nice tweet to kick this talk off, and it's a tweet from my friend Wilson. And he says, if I had a nickel for every time I saw someone say they're bringing crypto to the next billion people, I wouldn't even need to be in crypto, which is pretty true. A lot of people throw around the phrasing that their product or protocol is going to bring the next billion people into crypto. And when you hear it being stated, or rather, if you see it being stated in the title of a talk, and it's pretty justified if you want to scoff at it. My own opinion is that it takes a couple thousand people like me and you to ponder on this grand idea for one of us to actually hit it out of the park and actually bring a billion people to Web3. So that said, a developer's path to bringing Web3 to the billions. Taken as a statement alone, it is a pretty grand statement. It is a pretty broad statement. Nothing that a simple talk can cover entirely. So what I treat it as in my head is a slogan. A slogan is something that people can rally around, and bringing Web3 to a billion people is something certainly we can rally around. Everyone's here at the Web3 Con mainly because they think Web3 is actually good for the people. Everyone wants to bring Web3 to a billion people. And so throughout this talk, this statement is going to get the treatment of a slogan. It's a good rallying cry, but we kind of want to dig deeper, a layer deeper beneath the slogan. And so in my head, when we dig deeper, this being a developer-focused talk, comes the theme. And the theme I'm going to focus on is composability at the application layer. Again, treat it as a standalone statement. This is pretty broad. We can speak about the statement at a high level language, but as we go further along in the talk, we'll tie back this theme in. A theme is just something in the spirit of which we work. And the theme of this talk, something that we'll build up to, something in the spirit of which I will advocate that we work, is composability at the application layer. And again, digging deeper, going one layer below the theme, I would say, comes the strategy. Strategy that I'm going to espouse in this talk is build better abstractions that shorten time to productivity in Web3. This is a bit more specific than the theme, still pretty broad. We as developers work with abstractions all the time. What I mean by strategy here is the high-level direction in which we're going to work in the spirit of the theme. The strategy I have is more of a guiding strategy. We keep encountering and applying terminology like high-level or low-level. JavaScript libraries that we use to interact with smart contracts are an abstraction. Smart contracts themselves are an abstraction that we surmise, even more lower level details. A no-code smart contract builder is another abstraction that is useful for folks with no coding abilities. A key thing to remember is that you can have a tangible impact on software and its outcomes by just building at any level of abstraction. And so the strategy is, again, one of the things that we're going to tie back to in this talk. And I still want to keep digging deeper and go a layer beneath strategy. And in my head, when we do that, we hit something called tactics. And the tactics that I'm going to focus on in this talk, stated here as coordination, standards, and SDKs. Again, we know the direction in which we want to work. In the spirit of the theme, we've settled on The tactics is a concrete order of operations, by which I mean tangible actions that you and I can take in the spirit of the strategy that we've settled upon. So how are we going to build better abstractions in Web3 that shorten this quote-unquote time to productivity? And I will argue that it is with better coordination, without any qualifiers, just standards and SDKs. SDKs being the most specific term being thrown out there. And if I would just throw out some tactics at you people, it'd be somewhat useless. It'd be just like me standing on my soapbox giving you instructions. That's kind of not what I want to do here. And so to tie these tactics to something, I'm going to provide an anchor. I'm going to provide an example. Very conveniently, I work at ThirdWeb. I want to explain the ThirdWeb architecture as an example of this chain of things that I've described here. This chain of things being the slogan at the highest level, the theme coming after that, the strategy, and then the tactics, and now getting into the ThirdWeb architecture as an example. What I will try to do in this talk is go bottom up. I will start by explaining the ThirdWeb architecture, and I will showcase how the tactics I want to advocate for will be helpful ultimately in achieving the slogan, how applying the tactics I'm going to talk about does let us successfully implement this strategy of building better abstractions that shorten time to productivity in Web3. And following that, I will show how implementing the strategy I'm describing lets us indeed work in the spirit of the theme we've settled upon, composability at the application layer. And ultimately, I will argue composability at the application layer is how we're going to get Web3 to the billions. So getting to ThirdWeb, before explaining the ThirdWeb architecture, our landing page says ThirdWeb makes it easy for you to build Web3 apps. That's a pretty high level explanation. This is a developer focused conference, so I want to give a bit more of a technical explanation here. What ThirdWeb does is give you an entry point into Web3 development at every level of abstraction. By that, what I mean is we provide a dashboard to create and interact with smart contracts to people with no code abilities. So that puts you at the highest level of abstraction. We provide SDKs in languages like TypeScript, Python, Go. These are languages that you do not use to write smart contracts, not counting Rust and all the lovely Solana folks out there. But we provide SDKs in already popular developer languages, which you can use to create and interact with smart contracts. We provide a UI kit. If you're a smart contract developer, all of our contracts are available in a smart contract library. So just like you npm install OpenZeppelin contracts, you can npm install ThirdWeb contracts. So that's what I mean by us providing you an entry point at every level of abstraction, an entry point to Web3 development. And if you draw that out on a diagram, this is somewhat how it looks. Here you see pretty much every layer of a working dApp, and a working decentralized application. You have your front end, you have whatever tools you're using to get your front end to interact with a smart contract. You have a storage layer with IPFS there on the side. And then you have the actual smart contracts itself that are the single source of truth for your dApp. And what ThirdWeb does is here presented in the form of the SDKs we provide. But what ThirdWeb does is give you a tool at every level of this architecture for you to leverage to build out your dApp. And the thing that lets us provide you with these SDKs at every level of the architecture And how we get these pieces to coordinate together is that all of these pieces have some common information of how the smart contracts that are at the base of everything are going to behave. So let's say you have an SDK function on an NFT contract called balance off that gives you the total number of NFTs an address owns in an NFT collection. In that case, across the stack, be it the front end, the SDK, the application layer, or even the smart contracts, all of these three share some kind of common understanding that that what's being queried here is the information of how many NFTs does this address own in the given NFT collection. So this is not really the true magic in my eyes of something like the Third Web SDK. If you write your own contract and then you write your own SDK, and somehow all parts of your stack have a shared understanding of how your smart contract is operating, well, of course they do. And that's because you wrote the smart contract and you wrote the SDK that talks with the smart contract that you wrote. So there's no magic happening when Third Web SDK is talking to Third Web smart contracts. That should be pretty elementary. The true magic in my eyes is when, and this is possible with the Third Web SDK today, to a limited extent, the true magic in my eyes is when you can use the Third Web SDK to interact with an arbitrary smart contract that the Third Web SDK wasn't already anticipating, or a smart contract, say, that was not built using any piece of Third Web. And the Third Web SDK is still able to interface with that smart contract. And just to make a differentiation here between something like the Third Web SDK and something like Ethers.js. Ethers.js is a direct wallet implementation. The Third Web SDK is something that gives you a high-level API to interact with a smart contract. So again, to reiterate, it is easy for the Third Web SDK, or not really magical for the Third Web SDK to have a high-level API that lets you interact with a Third Web smart contract. It's magical if the Third Web SDK has a high-level API that lets you interact with an arbitrary smart contract. Now, before laying that capability out of the Third Web SDK, I mentioned it can do this to a limited extent. And that's because the SDK is limited in this domain to the kinds of interfaces that an arbitrary smart contract implements. So we all know of popular interfaces like the ERC20 interface, the ERC721 interface, the ERC1155 interface. An arbitrary smart contract implementing any of those interfaces can somewhat be anticipated by the Third Web SDK. And the Third Web SDK can successfully provide a high-level API to interact with a contract that implements one of those high-level interfaces. Now, something I will put out there is that high-level APIs to interact with smart contracts or any low-level stuff is actually desirable. And that's because it lets you get productive with the outcomes of those low-level things much faster. So that is one critical thing to accept if we're going to follow along this talk. It's that at some point people stopped writing C and developed a higher level API to do or accomplish the same lower level outcomes. So high level APIs are good. They're not always 100% better than writing lower level things, and it's clear why. That's because sometimes you do want to write code closer to the metal. Once we accept that high-level APIs are actually desirable, we can come to appreciate a fundamental hurdle with SDKs like the Third Web SDK, which give you a high-level API to interact with arbitrary smart contracts. And it's that things like the Third Web SDK depend on smart contracts implementing interfaces that the entire community at large has largely agreed upon to implement. And that's because what lets the Third Web SDK give you a high-level API to use for any arbitrary smart contract, currently limited to popular interfaces like ERC721, ERC20, or ERC1155, is the fact that the developer community has largely agreed upon implementing these standards and considering, for example, an ERC721 smart contract as an NFT smart contract, or a contract that implements ERC20 as a fungible token. And so this brings me to tactics. Clearly, if we understand that high-level APIs are desirable, and we see that a hurdle for these SDKs or API generators to accommodate arbitrary smart contracts is the developers community's settlement on certain standards and interfaces, we can start talking about the tactics for getting over that hurdle. And the clear tactics in my eyes that stand out are just better coordination. And better coordination here really boils down to three things. I believe when it comes to our Web3 development community, it's advocating for the adoption of standards, improving upon existing standards, and coming up with new standards. And these, I would like you to hear these three points as something actionable and something that you can, in fact, start doing right away and have an outsized impact on the Web3 development community. To actually drill that in, I want to give an example for each three where a successful person or a team in the space has actually taken one of these actions. And so for advocating for the adoption of standards, here's Joey Santoro. He's the co-founder of the successful FAY protocol. And here he's advocating for the adoption of EIP 4626. It is in Joey's Twitter name. He's tweeting about it all the time. He is pushing the EIP in more traditional media like news articles of CoinDesk. So ultimately, this act of advocating for standards boils down to opening up the EIP website. And pardon my ignorance, folks outside of the Ethereum ecosystem. My vocabulary is going to be a bit Ethereum specific. But yeah, read up on the various improvement proposals of your ecosystem, get a sense of where the space is heading. Eventually, you will find improvement proposals that you find meaningful and you find useful. You'll find a standard that clicks with you. Pick that standard up, read it, and advocate for the adoption of it. Find out who can adopt it and whose adoption of that standard can actually have an outsized impact on your entire ecosystem. A second thing is improving on existing standards. This one made a bit of a buzz. The team behind the successful Azuki project came out with a new standard that they themselves implemented for their NFT project, which was the ERC721A standard. It essentially reduced the cost of minting several NFTs in a single transaction, batch minting NFTs. And they did a great job at it. They did their research and they actually wrote a very nice article on it detailing the advantages of ERC 721A over the ERC 721 interface, and they wrote about the trade-offs too. So here's another option for you. Don't take standards like ERC 20, 721, 1155 as monoliths, just things that are going to remain the same forever. Go ahead and actually improve on their standards and write about it. Writing is essential here. If you can write about it and get people behind your improvements, maybe your improvement, your iteration over a canonical standard becomes the canonical standard over time. And the final point being, come up with new standards. For Ethereum, the EIP website has an entire page dedicated to detailing the process for publishing new EIPs. Come up with a new standard, publish an EIP, rally behind it, and maybe someone else comes in and improves upon your standard in the future. That's how the cycle begins. And so that covered all of the tactics that I had in mind. Again, I would like you to take away the fact that those tactics are actionable things. You can start advocating for the adoption of standards, you can improve on standards, and you can come up with new standards as well. What that ultimately allows for developers is to build better abstractions. Now that smart contracts will get started to be written in adherence to certain standards, tools like the SDKs can anticipate the behavior of these smart contracts. That's one way to think about building better abstractions or the outcome of better coordination. And what better abstractions do is they shorten our time to productivity in Web3 development. And I've had this time to productivity in big fat quotes throughout my talk. And there's a reason for that. I want to differentiate between two kinds of time to productivity. So there's this one kind of time to productivity that a good terminal will try to minimize. And that is simply you as a developer having an intent to write a program, and then the time taken for you to actually get started writing that program or finish writing that program. That's the kind of time to productivity that a tool like a good terminal tries to minimize. Now, this is all well and good, but the time to productivity that I would like to reference is something different. In the case of Web3, this is the time to productivity that I would like to reference. It is the time between your intent of leveraging a crypto primitive or a product and actually performing a full loop or MVP of that intent. An example of that is you encountering the idea of social tokens on Twitter and being like, hey, I want to create my own social token. How much time does it take you to actually spin up your own social token and execute a short experiment? That's the kind of time to productivity that I'm talking about. That's the kind of time to productivity that Third Web SDK tries to minimize. That's the time to productivity that better abstractions in the Web3 ecosystem will help minimize. And once it is pretty trivial to start leveraging different parts of Web3, these different Legos that we can now think of them as, we get something that I will phrase as composability at the application layer. By composability at the application layer, what I essentially mean is something that lets us build, for example, DeFi that my mom can use. I've been involved in the Ethereum ecosystem for about 2 years now, so not that much anyway. But it took me a damn while to learn how to use a product like Yearn.finance. Uh, it takes quite a bit of time to understand the underlying components of uh, what this website then presents beautifully. And still, despite the great work of the people at Yearn building a clean user interface on the Yearn.finance website, it is simply not something my mom can use. And Web3 is something that my mom should be able to use because the ethos of Web3 is not limited to people who can grok the workings of Yearn under the hood. So on the right, I have Yearn.finance, sort of the current state of what I'd consider a more involved DeFi product. And I've chosen Yearn as an example. I realize I've been calling it Yearn. Maybe it's called Y-Earn. My apologies if it is called Y-Earn. Just realized that. But on the left, I have something called Joinburst, built by my friend Samir. Now, Joinburst is like Yearn, an aggregator of strategies, except how it operates and the amount of options that it exposes and the kind of user experience that it offers is at a different level of abstraction than Yearn. And any user of the do can immediately pick up on that. And so where we want to go is in terms of direction from the left to the right. If we do want to bring DeFi and Web3 to a billion people, if my mom can use your app, then it's in that direction of bringing a billion people into Web3. And what lets us do this, what lets us build Web3 apps that my mom can use, in fact, is composability at the application layer. If it is easier for me to plug and play into Web3 Legos at the application layer without having to write custom smart contracts from the get-go, it results in more apps in the direction of easier UX that my mom can use being built. And ultimately, this was the ladder that we climbed in this talk. We started at the third web architecture. We ended up speaking of tactics, i.e., better coordination, advocating for the adoption of standards, improving our existing standards, coming up with new standards, all with the goal in mind that tools like an SDK, for example, the third web SDK, can start anticipating the behavior of what is at the base foundational layer, which is smart contracts. Implementing those tactics ultimately lets us build better abstractions that shorten time to productivity. That better abstraction being something like the SDK that can now anticipate smart contract behavior. That results in composability at the application layer, which means if I wish to leverage several Web3 Legos, I can do so quickly. I can set up short experiments and test my loops out. And eventually, that means more apps that my mom can use, more Web3 apps that my mom can use. And that, in my eyes, is a developer's path to bringing Web3 to the billions. To tie it all in, just like in my eyes, the job of Third Web is to give you an entry point in Web3 development at every level of abstraction. The developer's path to bringing Web3 to the billions is somewhat similar. Start operating at any level of abstraction that you feel you fit at. And that may be at the level of tactics, where you're advocating or creating standards. That may be at the level of strategy, where you are building tools like an SDK that now anticipates smart contract behavior, leveraging all the good coordination that the others are performing. That may be at the lowest level of writing smart contracts and famous foundational smart contracts that adhere to certain interfaces that the community settles on. That may be at the highest level of things, bringing Web3 to the billions, coming to conferences like these, listening to the ideas, sharing your own ideas. And that's pretty much all I had to say. See you later.